GLP-1 medications are doing more than just help people lose weight. They're actually forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about appetite, willpower, and what really causes obesity. Today, we're going to talk about some alternative explanations for how they actually work. Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can make more informed decisions about what you eat. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and over the past couple of episodes, we've been unpacking some of the controversial issues raised by a new book. It's called Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, written by former FDA Commissioner Dr. David Kessler. So we started out with the notion of food addiction and whether that's a valid or helpful framework for understanding overeating or obesity. And then last week, we talked about whether increased regulation of these quote-unquote addictive foods could be part of the solution. Well, this week, we're going to fit one more piece into this puzzle, and that is how these newly popular GLP-1 medications affect our desire for these foods in particular, and our tendency to overeat in general. After 50 years of steadily increasing rates of overweight and obesity, for the very first time, we are starting to see a reversal of that trend. And not a moment too soon. Almost 3 out of 4 American adults is now considered to have overweight or obesity. But now that number is starting to level out and perhaps even decline. And these new anti-obesity medications may have something, or a lot, to do with that. One of the most interesting things to me about this class of medications is how our understanding of how they work has evolved. At first, it was thought that these medications worked kind of mechanistically. They caused food to move more slowly through the digestive system, and this in turn led people to feel less hungry and to eat less. Now, for some people, this action of keeping food in the stomach for longer led to some queasiness and nausea. And this is the most commonly reported side effect for these medications. And for most people, the discomfort is mild to moderate, and it tends to diminish over time. Only about 10% of people who have taken these medications ended up discontinuing because the side effects were just intolerable. GLP-1 medications also trigger the release of insulin and suppress the secretion of glucagon, and both of those actions help to regulate blood sugar. Remember, the first generation of these meds were developed as a therapy for type 2 diabetes. And our bodies naturally produce GLP-1, by the way, which does all of those same things. But the synthetic version of GLP-1 in these medications has a much longer half-life. So it does the same things, but it does them for a lot longer. Once these medications were approved for the treatment of obesity, as well as type 2 diabetes, and became more widely used, it became increasingly clear that other mechanisms were also at work. We don't just have receptors for GLP-1 in our guts, we also have them in our brains. And these medications don't just decrease our physiological hunger, but also our hedonic hunger, the drive to eat just for pleasure. And this is what people are talking about when they talk about a reduction in food noise. And it's this effect on the reward centers of the brain that explains why GLP-1s are now being eyed as a potential therapy for things like alcohol use disorder or other forms of addiction. In his recent book, Dr. David Kessler relates how he has used GLP-1 medications to break what he characterizes as his food addiction, leading to substantial weight loss. But in talking with him about this, I was a little surprised to hear his take on how these medications work. He's convinced that the main way these drugs work is by making people feel so sick to their stomachs that food loses its appeal. Without these medications, he says, all of these highly palatable foods just hijack our brain's reward system, driving us to eat more and more of them in order to get that reward, even when it's causing negative consequences for us. So very similar to addiction. And for Kessler, GLP-1s provide a sort of aversion therapy and replace those positive associations with negative associations that then break that cycle of reinforcement and free us from the compulsion. Here's how he describes it.
These drugs work by slowing the gastrointestinal tract, the motility of the gastrointestinal tract. So food stays in your stomach longer. And what does that make us feel? I mean, it makes us feel nauseous. It takes us to the edge, that border, that edge of nausea. And that's in part, right? I mean, if you look at it, those are the adverse events, right? People talk about nausea, vomiting as the adverse events. But these drugs, I think in significant part, work through those adverse events. That's the mechanism of action. Because, I mean, what's strong enough? What's powerful enough to shut down or tamper down the addictive circuits? It's not clear. If I take you to that edge of nausea, right, that discomfort, that visceral malaise that's associated, I mean, that's going to tamp down the addictive circuits. I mean, that's in significant way how these drugs are working.
Now, I don't doubt that breaking the behavioral cycle can really help to diffuse its hold on us. Our behaviors are driven not just by neurochemical rewards, but also by habit and repetition, and, as we talked about last week, by convenience and social norms. But this idea that these medications work primarily by inducing a state in which we are too green around the gills to eat doesn't completely square with other sources. Obesity expert Ted Kyle, for example, when he writes and speaks about these medications, he tends to put more emphasis on the metabolic effects and the recalibration of the processes by which the body regulates food intake, metabolism, and fat storage. Because, as Ted points out, the disease of obesity is not caused by a lack of willpower or self-control, but by the dysregulation of these systems. I want to play you a brief clip from Ted, who joined me recently for a Smart Nutrition segment on WYPR. And here's what he said.
What these GLP-1s do is that they help correct some of the disorder in the metabolic function of your body that regulates how much you eat and how much weight you add on. And what we've learned from those medicines is that they are regulating signals between your brain and your gut to restore them to a more normal state for so long as you are taking them. And that puts you in a healthier metabolic state.
I have also worked with lots of people who have taken these medications, and their descriptions of their experience also don't quite square with Kessler's characterizations of his experience. Some of them have little to no digestive side effects. They don't ever feel sick to their stomachs. They simply just aren't as hungry. And when they eat, they get full much more quickly. Many of them say they just aren't as compelled by food. It just doesn't play as large a role in their thoughts or in their day. Often they also say that those hyperpalatable foods that used to make them lose control are no longer as appealing. They'd actually rather have a salad or a piece of fruit than a plate of fries or a sundae. And all of that suggests that the ways in which these drugs work on the brain may be even more significant than the ways they work in the gut. They seem to decrease the reward that some people get or expect to get from these foods. And that's a little different from replacing that reward with a negative experience, as Kessler describes. And finally, there is another theory out there. In a recent article on Substack, Gary Taubes challenges the idea that GLP-1 medications promote weight loss primarily by dampening the brain's reward response to food. Instead, he argues that these drugs work by by altering the way that the body partitions and utilizes fuel. So according to Taubes, these drugs may be reversing a kind of metabolic fat trapping in which the body prioritizes fat storage. So in his view, the reduction in appetite that people experience may be a secondary effect, a consequence of the body's improved access to its own stored fat. And a recent study published in Clinical and Translational Science offers partial support for his argument. This trial, which involved both mice and humans, found that in mice, tirzepatide appeared to reduce metabolic adaptation. So that's the well-known and heartbreaking phenomenon where the body responds to significant weight loss by slowing down your metabolism, which then makes maintaining that weight loss extremely challenging. So in mice, it appeared to reduce that effect. Unfortunately, this effect was not observed in the humans who were taking the drug. More importantly, though, the human subjects reported decreased hunger and increased satiety within the first 1 to 2 weeks of treatment, and that was long before any significant weight loss occurred. This supports the more conventional view that the weight loss is the result of decreased appetite and food intake, and not the other way around, as Taubes is arguing. Clearly, however, one of the reasons that these drugs have been so astonishingly effective is that they don't just have one single simple mechanism. It's not just the effects in the gut, or just the effects in the brain, or on our metabolism. It is likely all of the above. And there is clearly also a behavioral and a psychological dimension to this. As people start to experience success, to feel more in control, they are often then more willing, but also more able to make changes in their habits and in their environment. And I think we'd be foolish to discount any of those effects. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Although they may not be appropriate or even available to everyone, GLP-1 medications are not just a powerful tool in the fight against obesity. They are also giving us a lot of new insight into how our bodies and our brains regulate weight, hunger, and reward. And perhaps most importantly, they're showing us just how much of our eating behavior is driven not by character or willpower, but by biology. That recognition can really be liberating, not just for those taking these medications, but for anyone who has struggled to moderate their intake of food. And make no mistake, this is only the beginning of this revolution. There are dozens, possibly hundreds, of medications in the developmental pipeline that aim to refine, extend, or amplify the effects of these first and second generation GLP-1 drugs. Some of them target additional hormones, others focus on more tailored delivery or fewer side effects. Ironically, the success of these approaches could end up being a more effective way to achieve the kind of regulation of addictive junk food that Kessler is arguing for, by simply lowering the demand for them, which is going to reduce the incentives for food manufacturers to keep producing and promoting them. And if these drugs ultimately succeed in reforming our food landscape, maybe not as many of us would find ourselves needing these medications in the first place. Wouldn't that be something? As I say, this story is far from over, and as it develops, I will keep you informed as I strive to keep you up to date on all the most important developments in food and nutrition science. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, you can email me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And I'd also like to invite you to check out my other podcast. It's called The Change Academy, where we explore the art and science of creating positive behavior change, both in our own lives and in our workplaces and communities. You'll find it on all the major podcast platforms. Just search for Change Academy. Nutrition Diva is a quick and dirty tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is my audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Our thanks also to Nat Hoops for his support. And most of all, thanks to you for listening.